He laughed. Not the quiet, uncomfortable laugh of a man who didn't know what to say. This was loud, deliberate. Kind of laugh meant to carry across a room so that every head would turn and every eye would find her standing there, hat in hand, cheeks flushed, wearing her best dress, the one she'd mended twice at the collar, waiting for his answer. "You?" Gerald Hauser said, loud enough that the woman behind the dry goods counter stopped pretending to arrange bolts of fabric. "You honestly thought I'd consider you?" Nora Whitaker did not move. She stood in the middle of Caldwell's general store on a Tuesday morning in October, 1878, and she felt the floor try to swallow her whole. "I didn't mean any offense," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, she hated herself for saying them. "I didn't mean any offense." As if she were the one who had done something wrong. Gerald shook his head, still smiling, and picked up his purchase from the counter. "You're a nice enough woman, Nora. But a man's got standards." He walked out. The bell above the door rang once, cheerfully, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had just ended her. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely, utterly alone, if you have ever smiled when you wanted to scream, nodded when you wanted to walk out, said "I'm fine" when what you meant was "I am disappearing then," you already know what Nora Whitaker felt in that moment. This is her story. And it is not a small one. If this is your first time here, we are so glad you found us. Subscribe to the channel and follow Nora's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit the like button and leave us a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel now. Let's go back to Nora. She was 28 years old, and she had lived her entire life in Mill Haven, Kansas, which was the kind of town that prided itself on knowing everyone's business and calling that knowledge community. Her mother had died when Nora was 11, leaving behind a small house on the edge of town, a cast iron stove, a vegetable garden that needed more attention than it ever got, and a daughter who learned very early that the world did not slow down to accommodate grief. Her father, a quiet man named Elias Whitaker, had worked at the feed mill until a wagon accident took 2 fingers off his right hand and most of his confidence with them. After that, he worked when he could and drank when he couldn't, and Nora cooked and cleaned and managed the household accounts and told herself it was enough, that this was what love looked like, that not every family got to be the kind that laughed at the supper table. By the time her father died 4 years ago now, quietly, in his sleep, which was the most peaceful thing about him, Nora had been running a household for 17 years and had almost nothing to show for it except the ability to make a meal out of nearly nothing and the deep, settled certainty that she was not the kind of woman men chose. She was not ugly. She knew that, in the way a person can know a fact about themselves without quite believing it. She had brown eyes and a gentle face, and her hair, when she let it down, fell in soft waves past her shoulders. But she was heavy, had always been. Even as a girl, she had carried more of herself than other girls did, and the world had opinions about that. The world always had opinions. The women in town were not cruel, exactly. They were just honest in the way that people call honest when they mean unkind. "You have such a pretty face, Nora," which meant if only the rest of you matched. Or "you'd make some man a wonderful wife if you just applied yourself a little," which meant you are a project, not a person. She had applied herself. She had made pies for church socials and helped mend fences after the big storm 2 winters back and sat with Martha Greer through 3 days of fever when no one else would. She had been useful and patient and invisible, and she had waited, the way women were taught to wait, for someone to finally see her. Gerald Hauser had seemed, for 3 weeks, like a possibility. He was a widower, not young, with a small plot of land south of town. He'd asked her to walk with him twice, and once he'd brought her a jar of honey from his hives. She had let herself imagine, just a little, just enough. She had made the mistake of imagining. After he left the store, Nora stood there for another 20 seconds, counted them. She had gotten very good, over the years, at the performance of composure, She adjusted her hat. She smoothed the front of her dress. She said something to Mrs. Caldwell, she didn't know what, some pleasantry, something that ended the moment without making a scene, and then she walked out of the store and down the main street and didn't stop walking until she was past the edge of town, past the mill, past the old Greer property with its listing fence posts, and into the open field where the grass was going yellow, and the wind came in from the north, and nobody could see her. Then she sat down on the ground right there in the field, and she put her face in her hands. She didn't cry right away. She sat with it first. That was another thing she had learned to do. When the tears came, they weren't dramatic. No great heaving sobs. Nothing cinematic. Just her face crumpling in the way it did when she finally stopped holding everything so tight, and her breath going ragged for a minute, and the wind being cold on her wet cheeks. Cried the way a person cries when they are very tired, when the thing they're crying about isn't just today. A man's got standards. She pressed her palms flat against the ground. The grass was scratchy, and the earth was cold and solid beneath her, and she made herself feel that. Made herself stay in her body instead of floating up and away, like she sometimes did when things got too heavy. She was 28 years old. She had $18.40 to her name. She had a house she couldn't afford to keep heating through winter, and a town that had just watched her be humiliated and would be talking about it before sundown. She had no family left, no real prospects, and a growing suspicion that she had spent her entire life being useful to people who would not miss her when she was gone. For a long moment, sitting in that yellowing field with the wind in her face, Nora Whitaker thought very seriously about simply disappearing. Not dramatically, just leaving. Becoming someone nobody here remembered, thought was almost peaceful. She found the advertisement 3 days later, tucked into a 2-week-old copy of the Topeka Daily Capital that Mrs. Caldwell had been using to wrap parcels. She almost didn't read it. She was wrapping the last of her father's books to sell a decision that had taken her 4 days to make and 5 minutes to execute, and the paper was just there, and her eyes moved across the words the way eyes do when the mind is somewhere else. Then she stopped. Wanted capable woman to assist with care of 3 children, ages 4, 8, and 13. Widower, operating cattle ranch near Broken Creek, Nebraska. Hard country, harder work. No pretense made about conditions. Previous arrangements failed. Children come first. Respond to Box 14, Broken Creek Post. She read it twice, then a third time. It was not a romantic advertisement. It made no promises. Whoever had written it had deliberately stripped out anything soft, no mention of compensation, no description of the ranch or the man, no appeal to sentiment. Just the facts laid out the way you'd describe a fence that needed mending. Here is the job. Here is why the last person didn't stay. Children come first. She didn't know why that sentence caught her the way it did. Children come first. She had been second her whole life. She had been an afterthought, a pleasant surprise, a useful tool. She had never once been someone's first consideration. The idea that somewhere there were 3 children who were someone's absolute first, even if that someone was a stranger she'd never met, made something move in her chest that she didn't quite have a word for. She folded the advertisement and put it in her apron pocket. She told herself she was just thinking about it. She wrote the letter that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her best pen and the second to last of her good paper. And she wrote 3 drafts before she found the one that felt honest without being pitiful. She described her experience, the cooking, the household management, the years of caring for her father during his decline. She said she was unafraid of hard work and had no illusions about ranch life. She did not describe her appearance. She figured he'd learn that soon enough, and if it was going to be a problem, she'd rather find out by mail than by arriving somewhere she wasn't wanted. At the bottom she wrote, "I understand the previous arrangements didn't hold. I don't know what that means for your children, but I imagine it means they've had a hard time trusting. I'm patient with that kind of thing. I've had to be." She mailed it the next morning before she could change her mind. His name was Caleb Rourke. His reply came back in 9 days, which was faster than she'd expected for Nebraska. It was short, shorter than her letter, shorter than the original advertisement, really just 5 lines. Miss Whitaker, I received your letter. I'm not a man who does a lot of explaining and writing. If you're serious, I can arrange travel by the 15th. There are 3 children here who need someone stable more than anything else in the world. Cannot promise you it will be easy. I can promise you it will be real. Caleb Rourke. She held the letter for a long time, sitting at the same table where she'd writ it in her own. Cannot promise you it will be easy. I can promise you it will be real. She didn't know what kind of man wrote like that. She didn't know what the ranch looked like, or how far from town it was, or whether the children were difficult or the winters survivable. She didn't know anything about Caleb Rourke, except that he had a dead wife and 3 kids who'd already scared off whoever came before, and enough honesty to tell her straight out that he wasn't offering her anything easy. She thought about Gerald Hauser laughing in the middle of the general store. Thought about $18.40. She thought about the field, and the cold ground, and the almost peaceful feeling of wanting to disappear. Then she thought about children come first, and she thought about I can promise you it will be real. And she thought, when was the last time anything in your life was real, Nora? She wrote back the same afternoon. 1 line, I'll be on the 15th train. She sold the house. It didn't bring much. The place needed work. She'd never had money to do, but it was enough to cover the train ticket and leave a small buffer. She gave Mrs. Caldwell her mother's rocking chair because it was too big to take, and she couldn't stand the thought of leaving it with strangers. She packed 1 trunk, practical clothes, her mother's quilt, the cooking knives her father had never used, 3 books she'd kept back from the sale because she couldn't part with them. Told almost no one she was leaving. Mrs. Caldwell, she told, and Mrs. Greer, and that was it. She didn't owe anyone else an explanation, and she had a feeling had it for a while, now that most people in Millhaven would be relieved. Not mean-spirited about it. Just relieved the way you are when something you didn't know how to deal with quietly resolves itself. She did not let herself think too hard about what she was walking into. She had a talent for that kind of deliberate not thinking, focused on the next thing. The trunk, the ticket, the train platform, the next thing, and then the next. The morning of the 15th was cold and clear. She stood on the platform in Millhaven, Kansas, with her trunk at her feet and her hat pinned against the wind, and she looked at the town one last time. The mill, the Caldwell store, the church with the crooked weather vane, the street where she had grown up and worked and been looked past and waited and waited and waited. She did not feel sad, exactly. She felt something more complicated than sad, something that had grief and anger and something almost like relief, all pressed together into one feeling she didn't have a name for. The train arrived. She picked up her bag. She climbed aboard. Nobody came to see her off. She had known they wouldn't. And still, as the train pulled away and the platform shrank behind her, she kept her eyes forward, looking at where she was going instead of what she was leaving. She told herself that was the bravest thing she'd done in years. She wasn't entirely wrong. The train to Broken Creek took most of 2 days, with a change in Abilene and another in a town so small she couldn't find it on the map she'd brought. By the time she arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sky was doing something spectacular, all that flat Nebraska space letting the sunset spread out in ways Kansas never quite managed, and she was hungry and stiff and aware, for the first time in a visceral way, of how far she had come. Broken Creek was smaller than Millhaven. 1 main street, a handful of buildings, a livery, a church, a post office the size of a closet. A few people on the street turned to watch the train arrive with the particular attention of people who didn't see much new. She found the station master and asked if anyone had arranged a conveyance to the Rourke Ranch. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Rourke sent his hand. Yeah, big fella, red beard, wagon out front. He's waiting. Thank you, Nora said. She picked up her trunk, which was heavier than she remembered, and walked toward the door. The station master said something behind her. She almost didn't catch it. Hope you last longer than the others. She stopped, almost turned around to ask him what that meant. Others, plural, and said, with that particular tone of someone who knows more than they're saying. But she looked at the door and thought about the train platform in Millhaven and thought about turning and looking back, kept walking. The wagon driver was exactly as described, large, red-bearded, a man of maybe 40, with careful eyes and the kind of stillness that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He helped her trunk up without being asked and said his name was Dutch and that the ranch was about an hour's ride and that the children knew she was coming. "Mr. Rourke tell you much about the situation?" he asked, after they'd been going a few minutes. He said it was hard country and hard work. Nora said. Dutch nodded slowly, looked at the road ahead. He say anything about the kids? He said they needed someone stable. Another nod. Longer this time. That's one word for it. What's another word for it? Dutch thought about that for a moment. The wagon creaked, and the horse's breath made small clouds in the cooling air. Grieving, he said finally. Every one of them still grieving, including him. Just do it different. Nora looked at the open land rolling out around them, vast and quiet, and the color of old straw. How long has it been since their mother? 14 months. He paused. She died in the spring, late frost, got sick fast. Caleb, Mr. Rourke. He was out with the cattle when it happened. Didn't make it back in time. She absorbed that without speaking. The oldest, Ellie. She's 13. She's been running the house since. Way more than a girl that age should be doing. He said it, matter-of-factly. The way people who live close to hard things learn to describe them. The boy. Tommy, he's 8. He don't talk much anymore. Talked plenty before. The little one, May? She's 4. Cries at night still. Nora held all of that quietly. The wagon moved. The sky went from gold to a deep cold blue above the grass. What happened to the women who came before me? She asked. Dutch was quiet for a beat too long. First one left after 4 days. Said the conditions weren't what she'd expected. A pause. Second one, she made it 2 weeks. The kids were. They weren't kind to her, especially Ellie. That girl can be something when she decides she doesn't want you there. She didn't want them there, Nora said. No, Dutch agreed. She didn't. That's not the children being difficult, Nora said. That's a girl protecting her family from more loss. Dutch looked at her sideways. Something shifted in his expression that might have been reassessment. Huh, he said, not dismissively, more like a man hearing something he hadn't expected. They rode in silence after that. Not an uncomfortable silence, just the quiet of two people in a big landscape with things to think about. It was nearly dark when the ranch came into view. She saw it first as lights 2 windows yellow against the blue dark, and then the shape of the main house, a barn behind it, fence lines disappearing into the dark on either side. It was not a large place. It was not a pretty place, not in any deliberate way. It looked like something built to survive rather than to impress, and in the failing light, it looked sturdy and bleak and a little lonely, the way working ranches often do, and the work is done, and the quiet sets in. Dutch pulled the wagon up and climbed down, and Nora climbed down after him. And before she could reach for her trunk, the front door opened and light spilled out across the ground. The man standing in the doorway was not what she'd imagined. She'd expected someone older or harder looking. Caleb Rourke was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered by work and trouble into something quiet and watchful. He had his arms folded across his chest, and he was looking at her with an expression that gave nothing away. Behind him, in the doorway, barely visible, a small face peering around his elbow. May, 4 years old with her father's dark hair, looking at Nora with enormous solemn eyes. Caleb Rourke, said Miss Whitaker. Mr. Rourke, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way Gerald Hauser had looked at her, not measuring and dismissing. Just looking, the way a careful man looks at something new, before he decides what he thinks about it. Then he stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in," he said, cold. She picked up her bag and walked toward the light. The inside of the Rourke house was warmer than she'd expected, which was the first thing she noticed, and quieter than it should have been for a house. With 3 children, which was the second. May had disappeared the moment Nora crossed the threshold. 1 second the small face was there, peering from behind her father's arm, and the next she was simply gone back into the house, somewhere, retreated to wherever 4-year-olds go when the world presents them with something new and uncertain. Nora didn't reach after her, didn't call her name or try to make a moment out of it. She just let her go. Caleb closed the door behind them and stood for a second with his hand on the latch, like he was deciding something. Then he moved toward the table. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get you something to eat." "It's not much we ate early." "Whatever's there is fine," Nora said. "I'm not particular." Put a bowl of beans and a heel of cornbread in front of her without ceremony and poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat down across from her at the table. He didn't eat, just sat. He had the stillness of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, not restless, not performing anything, just present in the way animals and weather are present. She ate. He watched, not rudely, just the way a careful person takes stock of something they're trying to understand. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally. "You're quieter," she replied. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. "Dutch talk your ear off on the way in?" "Dutch told me what I needed to know." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "What did he tell you?" "About the children. About their mother." She kept eating. "About the women who came before me." He was quiet for a second. "Then you know the situation." "I know some of it." She set her spoon down. "I'd rather hear the rest from you." He looked at the table. Then he looked at her, and when he did, it was with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who had agreed to be honest, and was now reckoning with what that cost. "Ellie is the one you need to understand first," he said. "She's 13, and she has been running this house since her mother died. Cooking, cleaning, watching May when I'm out with the cattle. She didn't ask for that. I didn't ask her to do it. She just stepped into it." He stopped. "She stepped into it, and now she doesn't know how to step out, and she doesn't trust anyone who might try to take it from her. Because taking it from her means admitting she needed help," Nora said. "And admitting she needed help means admitting how bad it got." He stared at her. "Yes," he said. "Just that. What about Tommy?" Caleb's jaw worked for a second. "Tommy used to talk. He talked all the time, that kid. Never stopped. Every thought that went through his head came out his mouth." A pause. "He hasn't said more than 20 words at a stretch since March." He picked up his coffee mug and put it down without drinking from it. "The doctor in town says he'll come back to himself." "I don't know if that's true, or if that's just what doctors say." "And May?" "May is 4. She cries at night because she doesn't fully understand that her mother isn't coming back." His voice stayed level as he said it, but his hand tightened around the mug. "Keeps asking when Mama is coming home from wherever she went. Ellie tells her soon." "I haven't. I don't know what to tell her instead." Nora was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. May, probably, or whoever was moving around in the dark. "Where is Ellie now?" Nora asked. "In her room. She went when she heard the wagon. She doesn't want to meet me." She didn't want to meet the first 2, either. He looked at Nora steadily. "Miss Whitaker, I want to be straight with you. I don't know if this is going to work. Don't know if you're going to be here in 2 weeks or 2 months. I don't know if Ellie is going to make it impossible, or if Tommy is going to stay shut down, or if May is going to cry every night for the next year. I can't promise you this house is going to be easy to be in." "You already said that," Nora told him. "In your letter. I'm saying it again so you hear it in person." "I heard it the first time," she said. "I came anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and picked up her empty bowl. "I'll show you where you're sleeping," he said. The room was small, off the back of the kitchen. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out on nothing but dark. It had the particular emptiness of a room that had been used by someone who didn't stay, that particular feeling of surfaces that hadn't held anyone's things long enough to remember them. She unpacked only what she needed for the night. She was too tired for more. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house settle around her and thought about nothing in particular for a little while, which was a skill she had gotten good at. Over the years, the ability to just be in a moment without forcing it to mean anything. Then she blew out the lamp and lay down and listened to the wind pick up outside and tried to sleep. She was almost there when she heard it, small, quiet. Coming from just outside her door, she lay still. It came again, not a knock, not a voice, just a small sound, shuffle, like someone standing very close to the door, not sure what to do next. Nora stayed where she was. She didn't get up and she didn't call out. She just said, quietly enough that only someone standing right at the door could hear, "You don't have to come in. It's all right either way." Silence. Then nothing. Footsteps retreating down the hall. Very small footsteps, the kind that belong to a 4-year-old who doesn't fully understand what she was doing, standing there in the dark in the first place. Nora closed her eyes, and this time she slept. Morning came without ceremony. The ranch didn't allow for ceremony. There were animals to feed and a fire to build up and breakfast to make, and Nora was up before the sky went fully light, because that was what her body knew how to do after years of doing it alone and with. She found the kitchen easily enough and got the stove going and located the cornmeal and the salt pork and the coffee and set about making something that resembled a proper breakfast. She was midway through it when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavier than May's, more deliberate, and she knew without turning around that it was Ellie. She didn't turn around. She just kept working at the stove and said, "Morning. Coffee's almost ready." Nothing. She waited 2 full beats. Then she said, "Can you tell me where your father keeps the skillet? I found one, but it's got a crack in the handle, and I don't want to use it if there's another." Pause. A long, loaded pause of the kind only a 13-year-old who is being carefully stubborn can produce. Then cabinet by the back door, bottom shelf. "Thank you," Nora said. She went to the cabinet and found it where Ellie said it would be, and came back to the stove without looking at the girl at all. She heard Ellie sit down at the table. Not warmly. More the way someone sits in a chair they're not sure, yet belongs to them. The silence stretched. Nora scrambled eggs and turned the salt pork and let it stretch without trying to fill it. She had learned, a long time ago, that silence only became unbearable if you let it, and that some people, particularly hurt and watchful people, needed to see that you could sit in quiet with them before they decided you were worth talking to. By the time Caleb came in from the barn, and Tommy appeared from upstairs, blinking and tousled and regarding Nora with the flat, careful look of a child who had learned that strangers don't last, there was a real breakfast on the table. Not impressive. Just real eggs and pork and biscuits that had come out slightly too dense and coffee so strong it had its own opinions. May came last, padding in small bare feet, and stopped when she saw Nora at the stove. Stared. Nora looked at her for a second and then looked away, back to her work, giving the child room. Caleb said, "May, this is Miss Whitaker." May said nothing. She climbed into her chair and sat with her hands in her lap and kept watching Nora with those enormous eyes that didn't miss anything. They ate. It was not comfortable, exactly. Ellie ate without looking at Nora. Tommy ate methodically, like eating was a task to be completed. Caleb asked Dutch what the weather was doing, and Dutch, who had apparently appeared from somewhere outside, answered in the monosyllabic way of a man who had long since said everything he needed to say about weather. May ate most of her eggs and then pushed the rest around her plate. At the end of it, when Caleb and Dutch stood to go back out, Nora started clearing the table. Ellie stood immediately. "I'll do that," she said. Her voice was flat, but the intention behind it was sharp territorial, the way a person is territorial about something they've claimed in the absence of anything else. "All right," Nora said. She stepped back from the table. "Start on the washing, then." Ellie blinked. She'd been expecting resistance, Nora could tell. The prepared set of her jaw softened just slightly, which she probably didn't know she was doing. "Washboard's in the lean-to," she said. "The water's already been drawn." from this morning." "Thank you," Nora said, same as she'd said about the skillet. She went to the lean-to and started on the washing. It was hard, cold, physical work, and her hands ached with it inside 20 minutes. She kept at it steadily and didn't stop. From the lean-to she could see the yard and part of the barn, and after a while, she saw Tommy drift out of the barn and stand near the fence, looking at the cattle with his hands in his pockets. Stood there a long time, not doing anything, just standing. A boy who had been reduced to standing and watching and keeping his thoughts entirely inside himself. She didn't call to him. She watched him for a moment and then went back to the washing. First real test came on the 4th day. It wasn't dramatic. The hard things rarely are at the beginning. It was just an ordinary morning that turned sideways in an ordinary way. And what mattered was what happened in the 3 minutes after it turned. May had spilled a full cup of milk. Not deliberately, she'd reached for something across the table the way 4-year-olds do, without accounting for the physics of the situation. And the cup had gone over, and the milk had gone everywhere. All over the table, all over May's dress, all over the floor. May froze. Her face went the specific white of a child waiting to be yelled at. Nora saw it. She saw the freeze and the braced shoulders, and the way May's lower lip had pulled in like she was making herself very small. And she understood in an instant what that meant, that in the months since her mother died, in the scramble of grief and exhaustion, and a father doing his best with cattle and a 13-year-old doing her best, with everything else, there had probably been yelling. Not cruelty, just the particular explosive moments that happen in overwhelmed households where everyone's nerves are stripped raw and small disasters land on big wounds. "Oh, that's a lot of milk," Nora said. May stared at her, still braced. "Good thing we've got 2 rags," Nora said. She went to the counter and got them and handed one to May. "Here, you take the table. I'll take the floor." May took the rag. She looked at it. Then she looked at Nora. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I know you didn't," Nora said. She was already on her knees wiping the floor. Cups tip over. It's what cups do. I've spilled about 1,000 things in my life, and I expect I'll spill 1,000 more. May was quiet for a second. "How many?" "Oh, at least 1,000. Maybe more. There was an incident with a whole pot of stew when I was about your age. Right off the stove." Everywhere, she sat back and looked up at May with an expression of mild horror at the memory. "Your shoes?" May looked down at her feet. "I don't got shoes on." "Well, there you go. Already doing better than I did." Something happened on May's face then. Something cracked open just slightly, like a window in a room that has been closed too long. Her lower lip released from where she'd been holding it. Her shoulders dropped maybe an inch. She didn't smile, but she stopped being afraid. She wiped the table with the rag, messily, in the way of a 4-year-old who is doing her genuine best. Ellie had watched all of it from the doorway. Nora had known she was there. Had known from the moment she heard the quiet step in the hall that paused just short of the kitchen, but she hadn't acknowledged it, and she didn't now. She just finished the floor and rinsed the rags, and poured May a fresh cup of milk, half full this time, and went back to making bread. Ellie's footsteps retreated up the hall, but she had seen. Nora knew she had seen. The town was called Broken Creek, and it had opinions about everything, the way small towns in the 1870s did. Opinions about weather and cattle prices and the railroad coming through and who was drinking too much and whose wife had what illness and whether the new school teacher was as educated as she claimed. It had opinions, specifically, about the situation at the Rourke Ranch. Nora learned this on her first trip into town, which was 11 days after she arrived. She went with Dutch in the wagon for supplies. She'd made a list the night before: flour, salt, lamp oil, some needles and thread, a few things for the children that the house was running low on. The general store in Broken Creek was run by a man named Garrett, who was not unfriendly exactly, but had the quality of a man who stored information the way a granary stores grain carefully, abundantly, and always with an eye toward future use. He was polite to her. He filled her order. He charged her fairly. But she noticed the way the two women in the store went quiet when she came in. Not subtle about it either. The quality of quiet that is itself a statement. She paid for her goods and thanked Mr. Garrett and went back out to the wagon where Dutch was waiting. Dutch looked at her, and she looked at Dutch, and something passed between them that didn't need words. On the way back, he said, "People talk." "I know," she said, "about a woman living out at the ranch." Unmarried, he said it carefully, without judgment in his voice, but with the weight of a man telling her something she needed to know. Some of the ladies in town have views about the arrangement. What kind of views? The kind that involve a lot of certainty about what's proper. Nora looked at the road ahead of them, flat and brown, and going straight into the horizon. What did they say exactly? Dutch was quiet for a second. That it isn't right. A young unmarried woman living under a widower's roof. That it sets a bad example. That there's something irregular about it. He paused. Mrs. Hartwell at the church auxiliary has apparently been quite vocal. Is Mrs. Hartwell one of the women who answered the advertisement? Nora asked. Dutch made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. No, Nora said. She didn't say anything else for a while. She sat with the information, the way she'd learned to sit with hard things, not fighting it, not pretending it wasn't there, just holding it while she figured out what it actually weighed. The children needed her. That was the simple fact. Complicated facts were everything surrounding it, and the complicated facts were going to be complicated whether she liked it or not. Has Mr. Rourke heard about this? He's heard, Dutch said. He doesn't say much about it. What does Ellie know? Dutch was quiet for a beat too long again. Ellie goes to town with me sometimes. She's got ears. Nora closed her eyes briefly. A 13-year-old girl who was already carrying more than she should, hearing the town talk about the woman living in her house. That was going to land somewhere. She didn't know where yet, but it was going to land. It landed 9 days later, on a Tuesday, in the middle of a lesson. Nora had started trying to work with Tommy on his reading. Not formally, there was no schoolhouse within reasonable distance of the ranch, and Caleb had mentioned then that the children's education had gone patchy since their mother died. She didn't announce it as school. She just started leaving books out and picking them up herself and reading in whatever room Tommy happened to be in, and eventually, the way water finds cracks in stone, the boy had started drifting closer to wherever she was. He still didn't talk much. He had the quality of someone who has decided that words are expensive and is spending them carefully, but he would sit near her. And sometimes, when she was reading aloud, she'd see his lips moving along with the words, the way a child's do when they've heard a passage before and know where it's going. That day she had a copy of a novel, one of the 3 she'd brought from Kansas, open between them at the kitchen table. Tommy was following along, his eyes tracking the page, and Nora was reading slowly enough for him to keep up without making it obvious she was doing so. Ellie came in from outside. Cold from the yard, cheeks wind-burned, something worked up in her face that she'd clearly been carrying in from a distance. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Nora and said, "Mrs. Hartwell says you shouldn't be here." Tommy went completely still. Nora kept her eyes on the page for 1 beat, 2. Then she looked up at Ellie. The girl's jaw was set, and her eyes were bright. Not with tears. Ellie didn't seem like a girl who cried easily, but with the particular heat of someone who has been holding something and has finally decided to put it down hard. "What did Mrs. Hartwell say exactly?" Nora asked. "That it isn't proper. You living here. That Papa should have thought about what people would say before he brought an unmarried woman into the house." Ellie's voice was tight, controlled. She said it in front of Mrs. Grover and Mrs. Pace, and she said it loud. "Were you in town?" "I was with Dutch." I heard her. Nora set the book down. She didn't get up, didn't make any dramatic movements. She just looked at Ellie steadily and let the girl say her piece. "Is she right?" Ellie demanded. "Should you not be here?" "That depends on what you think the point of me being here is," Nora said. Ellie blinked. She hadn't expected that answer. "What does that mean?" "It means if the point is to make Mrs. Hartwell comfortable, then no, I probably shouldn't be here. But if the point is to make sure May stops looking like she's waiting to be yelled at and Tommy doesn't have to sit alone at the table every morning and you, Nora paused, and you don't have to be the only adult in a house that needs one, then the question gets more complicated. Kitchen went quiet. Tommy was watching both of them with the flat, unblinking attention of a child learning something from the way adults talk to each other. Ellie looked at the floor, then at the wall, then back at Nora, and her face had changed, not softened exactly, but shifted, like a door that was still closed but was now unlocked. Called you, Ellie stopped. Swallowed. She called you names. The women talking with her. About how you look. Nora felt that land somewhere quiet and familiar in her chest. I expect she did, she said. Doesn't it bother you? Yes, Nora said simply. Of course it does. Ellie stared at her. She'd expected something else, deflection, maybe, or dignity, or the kind of performance of being above it that adults sometimes put on to seem stronger than they are. She hadn't expected, yes, of course it does, said in a plain, quiet voice by a woman who clearly meant it. Then why do you stay? Ellie asked. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Tommy, who was still watching them both with those careful eyes. Then she looked back at Ellie. Because what Mrs. Hartwell thinks of me has nothing to do with whether your sister sleeps through the night, she said. And right now, that matters more. Ellie stood in the doorway for another few seconds. Then she went upstairs without another word. But she went upstairs without slamming anything, which was a kind of answer in itself. Tommy looked at Nora. He looked at the book on the table. Then he pulled it slightly toward himself and looked at the page. Where were we? He said. His voice was quiet and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used much. But it was there. Nora found the line. Right here, she said, about halfway down. He nodded. She read. He followed. The nights were the hardest part, not for her, but for May, and watching it be hard, for May made it hard for everyone else. It had been going on since before Nora arrived. Dutch had told her that, and Caleb had told her that, and she'd heard it herself on the second night. The small crying from the room at the top of the stairs that went on for 20 minutes, and then stopped, and then started again. Caleb went to her. He was good at going to her. He would sit on the edge of her bed in the dark and hold her hand and say her name quietly until the crying slowed, and he did it every time without complaint. But Nora could see in the morning what it cost him, the particular exhaustion of a man who is grieving himself and has to keep putting that away to be steady for someone else. On the third week, May's crying started around midnight. Nora lay in her room and listened to Caleb's footsteps cross overhead and then go quiet as he settled in with her. The crying slowed, then stopped, then started again, softer. Nora got up. She didn't think about it much, she just got up, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and went upstairs. She stopped at May's door, which was open. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the bed, with May curled against his side, and his eyes came up when Nora appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted and a little helpless, the look of a man doing all the right things and finding they're still not quite enough. Nora came in and sat on the other side of May. She didn't say anything, didn't announce herself. She just sat and put one hand gently on May's back, a slow and steady pressure, the way you'd calm an animal. Not rubbing, not patting. Just there, May's breathing changed, slowed. The crying sound stopped, replaced by the hitching breath of a child coming down from distress. After a few minutes, May shifted, turned slightly toward Nora, and put her small face against Nora's arm. Not Caleb's, Nora's. Nora went completely still inside herself. She didn't look at Caleb. She kept her eyes on the dark window and her hand moving in that slow, steady rhythm on May's back. In a little while, May was asleep. They sat there for a minute, in the dark, the two of them, with the child between them and the wind going on outside and the house breathing around them. Then Caleb stood carefully so as not to wake her. He looked at Nora for a moment, a long, complicated moment, and then he nodded once, barely perceptible, and went to the door. Paused there. Thank you, he said quietly. Go sleep, Nora told him. You look terrible. The sound he made was not quite a laugh, and not quite not one. Then he went to his own room, and she heard his door close softly. She stayed a few more minutes with May, listening to the child's steady breathing. Then she stood and went back downstairs. In the kitchen, she sat at the table in the dark for a while, not lighting a lamp. She sat and listened to the house, which was quiet now, genuinely quiet, the kind of quiet that has been earned. She had not thought, when she stepped off that train platform in Millhaven with her one trunk and her $18, that quiet could feel like something. But it did. This quiet felt like something. It felt like a room where people had stopped bracing for the next blow. Not safe yet. Nothing out here was safe. She knew that. Closer. She was just getting up to go back to her room when she heard the sound on the stairs. Too heavy for May, too light for Caleb. She waited. Ellie appeared at the foot of the stairs in her nightgown, hair loose, looking younger than she did in daylight. She stopped when she saw Nora at the table. "I heard May," Ellie said. Her voice was defensive before Nora had said a word. "I was going to go to her." "I know," Nora said. "You always do." Ellie stood at the bottom of the stairs with her arms folded, and something in her face was moving through something complicated that she didn't have the words for, yet. Didn't trust herself to say. "She settled down faster," Ellie said finally. "It came out low and tight like it cost her." "She did," Nora agreed. No elaboration. Ellie looked at the table, the dark window. "I don't," she started, stopped. Started again. "I don't know how to stop being in charge of everything. I've been doing it so long, I don't know how to stop." Nora looked at her, this thin, tired girl with her jaw always set and her eyes always guarded, who had picked up the weight of a household at 12 years old and carried it because no one else was there to carry it, and had done it so well that the weight had become her shape. "You don't have to stop," Nora said. "You just have to not do it alone. There's a difference." Ellie looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time not through the lens of suspicion or evaluation or self-protection. Just looked. "Okay," she said, quietly, like something settling. Then she turned and went back upstairs. Nora sat in the dark kitchen for another few minutes. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals that ticked softly. The wind had eased. From upstairs, nothing, just the sound of a house finally resting. She should have gone back to bed. She knew she should. Morning came early, and the day ahead would be full. But she sat there a few minutes longer, because this feeling, this particular quality of quiet and warmth, and the sense that something had shifted slightly in the right direction, was new enough that she didn't want to rush past it. She had been rejected by her town. She had been mocked in a general store. She had come here with nothing, because nothing was what she had. And she had not fixed anything. Not really. These children were still grieving. This man was still closed around his grief like a fist. The town was still talking. Nothing was resolved or healed or wrapped up clean. But May had turned toward her in the dark, and Ellie had stood at the bottom of the stairs and said, "Okay," in a voice that meant something. And Tommy had asked where they were in the book. It wasn't much. She knew it wasn't much. But she had learned, over 28 years of getting by, that the small things were usually where the real things started. That love, when it came, didn't arrive all at once like a weather event. Came in cups of coffee, set without ceremony, and rags for spilled milk, and "Okay," said quietly at the bottom of a staircase. And where were we from a boy who had stopped talking? She got up. She went to bed. Outside, the wind picked back up and rattled the windows, and she lay in the narrow room, listening to it, and did not feel, for once, like she was on the wrong side of the glass. November came in hard and cold, the way Nebraska Novembers do not gradually. Not with any courtesy, just a morning where the air had a different quality to it, and the ground was different underfoot, and you understood without being told that the season had made a decision. Nora had been at the Rourke Ranch for just over 5 weeks. She knew the house now, the way you know a place you've worked, rather than a place you've loved, practically, specifically, without sentiment. She knew which floorboards announced themselves, and which stayed quiet. She knew the stove ran hot on the left side and needed watching in the mornings. She knew Caleb took his coffee black, and without comment, that Tommy ate faster when he was anxious about something, that May would only eat the crusts of bread if they were cut off first, but would eat the rest without complaint, and that Ellie's tell for being overwhelmed was not tears or anger, but a sudden excessive tidying plates moved to precise positions, cups aligned, a frenzy of small order imposed on things that didn't need ordering. She knew these things the way she'd always known useful things, quietly, without making a show of knowing them. What she didn't know yet was Caleb. Not really. She knew the surface of him the early mornings, and the late returns from the range, the short sentences and the watchful eyes, the way he sat at the dinner table and listened more than he talked, the way he looked at his children sometimes, with an expression so exposed she had to look away from it. She knew he was a good man who was doing an imperfect job of grief, which meant he was doing it the way most people do, by keeping busy, by working until his body made him stop, by being steadily present for his children, even when that presence had nothing left in it. What she didn't know was what he made of her. She had stopped trying to figure it out, because figuring it out required a kind of hope she'd trained herself out of over 28 years. And hope, in her experience, was the thing that made the fall worse. The morning the first real snow came, she was at the stove when she heard the back door, and Caleb came in stamping mud from his boots, pulled his coat off and hung it on the peg without ceremony, and came to stand at the far end of the stove, warming his hands. He smelled of cold air and cattle and the particular outdoors smell of a man who has been working in it since before dawn. "Snow's coming," he said. "I can see it trying," she said. He looked out the window. "Real snow maybe by afternoon," he paused. "Cattle are already restless." "Do you need Dutch today?" "Dutch and me both. All day probably." He looked at her. "The children's." "We'll be fine," she said. "Go." He looked at her a beat longer than necessary. Not with suspicion, and not with doubt, with something else. Something she couldn't name, or wasn't going to try to name. "There's a loose board on the north side of the porch," he said. "Going to fix it before the snow." "Where do you keep the hammer?" He blinked. "Tool chest, lean-to." "But I can fix a loose board," she said. Another moment. Then he said, "Nails are in the tin on the second shelf." And he went back out. She fixed the porch board that morning, while May sat nearby, wrapped in a blanket, providing a running commentary on the activity that was almost entirely inaccurate and entirely charming. Tommy appeared after a while and held the nails without being asked. He watched her work with that quiet, evaluating attention, and when she finished and sat back and declared it done, he said, "How did you know how to do that?" "My father wasn't much use around the house," she said. "So I learned." Tommy thought about that. "Papa knows how," he said. "He just doesn't have time." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm here for." "Some of it anyway." Tommy looked at the board, flush now against the porch frame. Solid. "It's good," he said, with the straightforward authority of an 8-year-old issuing a verdict. "Thank you," Nora said. He went back inside. May patted the board approvingly with one small hand and followed him. Norris sat on the fixed porch for a moment in the cold, looking at the sky coming down gray and heavy from the north, and felt something uncomplicated move through her. Not happiness exactly. Satisfaction, maybe. The particular satisfaction of useful work done in a place that needed it. The snow came by 2 in the afternoon, as Caleb had predicted. By evening it was 3 inches and still going. Caleb and Dutch came in after dark, cold and short-tempered in the way of men who have been fighting weather all day, and Nora had soup on the stove and bread that had come out right this time, and a warm kitchen that pushed back against the dark. Caleb sat down and ate without talking for several minutes. Then he looked up and said, "The cattle are in the north pasture. We got them all." "Good," Nora said. He ate some more. May was telling him something about the porch board in her rambling 4-year-old way, and he listened to her with the careful attention he always gave her, nodding at the right moments. Tommy ate with his book propped against his glass, which Nora had decided weeks ago was a fight not worth having. Ellie had made the bread, actually had appeared in the kitchen that afternoon, and simply started making it without being asked or invited. working beside Nora with the quiet efficiency of a girl who had been cooking from necessity for a year and a half. She hadn't said much while they worked, but she'd worked, and that was a language Nora understood. After supper, after the children had gone up May, going willingly for once, genuinely tired from a day of snow watching, and porch inspecting Caleb stayed at the table. Nora was cleaning up. She was aware of him in the way you're aware of something that has been still for a long time, the awareness of waiting. She's been sleeping better, he said. Nora didn't have to ask who. Yes, whatever you've been doing at night. When she wakes, he stopped. It helps. It's not complicated, she said. She just needs someone there. I'm there. I know you are. She rinsed the bowl in her hands. But you're also her father. When she cries for her mother, you're the reminder that her mother is gone. It's not your fault. It's just she paused, choosing words carefully. Sometimes a child needs someone who isn't carrying the same loss they are. He was quiet for a long moment. When she glanced over, he was looking at the table, his hands around his coffee mug, and his face had the quality it got. Sometimes, when something had landed somewhere real. I didn't think about it that way, he said. You didn't have to, she said. You were busy keeping everything else from falling apart. He looked up at her then. So were you, from what I can see? She didn't answer that. She finished the dishes and wiped her hands and hung the cloth. Ellie made the bread today, she said. Something shifted in his face. I know. I could tell. He paused. It was her mother's recipe. Nora hadn't known that. She turned slightly to look at him. Claire used to make it on Fridays, he said. Ellie stopped after he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She hasn't made it since spring. Nora stood there a moment with that information, feeling its weight. A 13-year-old girl who had stopped making her mother's bread because making it hurt to it today stood in the kitchen and made it beside a woman who wasn't her mother, who hadn't announced it or explained it or asked for recognition of what that cost. She's stronger than she knows, Nora said quietly. Yes, Caleb said. Just that. And the word had everything in it. It was Dutch who told her about the meeting. He came to find her at the end of the second week of November, when the snow had settled and the days had taken on the short, gray quality of winter on the plains. She was in the lean-to mending a split seam in one of Tommy's coats when Dutch appeared in the doorway and stood there with his hat in his hands, which was how she'd learned. He indicated that something needed saying. There's been a meeting, he said, in town. At the Hartwell place. She kept her eyes on the seam. What kind of meeting? The organizing kind. He shifted his weight. Mrs. Hartwell has been talking to a few of the other women. And apparently she's gotten Reverend Marsh involved. Nora's hand stilled on the coat. What does the Reverend have to say? He's apparently written a letter, Dutch said, to Caleb about the impropriety of the situation. He said impropriety like a word he'd borrowed from someone else, which it probably was. And Mrs. Hartwell is talking about going to the county seat, about getting some kind of formal complaint made. Nora set the coat down on the workbench. She sat for a moment and looked at the wall. Outside, the wind pushed at the lean-to's thin walls, found the gaps, moved through. Has Caleb seen the letter? She asked. Came yesterday. He hasn't said much about it. Has he said anything? Dutch turned his hat in his hands, he said. And this is a quote, it can go straight to hell. Something moved through Nora that was not quite relief and not quite amusement. And Mrs. Hartwell? She's not going to stop at a letter. No, Dutch agreed. She's not. Nora picked the coat back up, found the needle. She started on the seam again, slowly, because her hands needed something to do while she thought. Dutch, she said, what do people in this town think of Caleb before all this? He's well respected, Dutch said without hesitation. He's a fair man, good with his word, helped 3 families through bad years without asking anything back. He paused. People were sorry when Claire died. There's real feeling for him in this town, for the children, but not for me. Dutch was quiet. That's all right, she said. I expected it. She kept sewing. Question is whether the feeling for him is strong enough to outweigh what misses. Hartwell's stirring up. or whether she's going to make it so that me being here becomes a bigger problem for him than me leaving. Dutch looked at her with an expression that was hard to read respect, maybe, or something close to it. I think about most things, she said. Just don't always say them out loud. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do? She cut the thread and turned the coat over to check the seam. I'm going to finish mending Tommy's coat, she said. And then I'm going to make supper. And then I'm going to think about it some more. She held the coat up, examined the repair. There's no point deciding anything until I know how serious it gets. Dutch nodded once and put his hat back on his head. You're a steadier person than most people I've met, he said, and then seemed vaguely embarrassed to have said it and went back out into the cold. The letter from Reverend Marsh sat on the kitchen table the next morning when she came down. Caleb had clearly put it there, deliberately left it where she'd see it, which meant he'd decided she had a right to see it. She read it. It was not cruel. That was the worst part, in a way. It was thoughtful and measured and filled with genuine concern, the language of a man who believed he was doing right, the impropriety of the arrangement, the effect on the children's moral education, the community's discomfort, the risk to Caleb's own standing among his neighbors. It suggested gently but firmly that if Mr. Rourke required domestic assistance, a more appropriate arrangement could surely be found an older woman, perhaps a widow herself, someone whose presence in the household would occasion no confusion about its nature. She set the letter down and went to start the coffee. Caleb came in from outside a few minutes later. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Nora. I should have put that somewhere else, he said. No, she said. You were right to leave it out. He sat down. She poured his coffee, and then poured her own, and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a moment, with the letter between them like a third presence at the table. I wrote back last night, he said. Told him it was my house and my family, and I'd make decisions about both myself. That's going to make it worse, she said. Probably. He looked at her directly. I don't particularly care. Caleb. She said his name for the first time, and felt both of them register it, the small shift of formality dropping. You need to care. Not because they're right, but because they can make things difficult for you in ways that are real. Your cattle go to market through this county. Your credit is with the bank in this town. Your children, she stopped. Ellie already knows the women in town are talking. She hears it. His jaw tightened. I know. I'm not saying they're right, she said again carefully. I'm saying their wrongness doesn't make the consequences go away. He looked at his coffee. What are you suggesting? Quiet for a moment. This was the part she'd been turning over since Dutch told her, the part she'd lain awake with. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm still thinking. He looked at her. You're not. He stopped. Started again. If you're thinking about leaving, I need to know that. Children. I know what leaving would do to the children, she said. I'm not dismissing that. She held his gaze. I'm not making any decisions right now. I'm telling you, I'm thinking. He was quiet. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had been trying very hard to hold several large things at once and was feeling the weight of all of them simultaneously. Not weak, just tired in the particular way that comes from too long without anyone to set things down with. She's not a bad woman, he said suddenly. Hartwell. She brought food after Claire died. She sat with May for an afternoon when I had to take Tommy to the doctor. He stared at the table. She genuinely believes what she's saying is right. I know, Nora said. That's what makes it complicated. She wrapped her hands around her mug. People who are doing harm because they think they're doing good are harder to deal with than people who know they're causing trouble. He made a sound that was not a laugh, but was in that direction. That's a true thing. They sat with the morning for a minute. Then he stood and picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, not throwing it away, not leaving it on the table either. Figure it out, he said. So will I, she said. He looked at her. There was something in his face that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but was in that neighborhood the look of a man who has not had someone to navigate alongside in a long time and is remembering what it's like. Then he went back outside and Nora went back to starting breakfast. The thing with Ellie happened on a Saturday. Nora had been helping her with sewing, a practical matter, nothing more, mending winter clothes that needed doing before the deep cold set in for good. They worked side by side at the kitchen table, which had become, over the past few weeks, the place where things happened between them. Not breakthroughs, nothing that dramatic. Just the slow, incremental accumulation of shared work and tolerated proximity that is how some kinds of trust build. Ellie was working on a hem. She was competent but impatient with the needle, stabbing at the fabric in a way that was going to result in uneven stitches, and she knew it. Nora watched her for a minute without saying anything, then she said, "Try slowing down. It goes faster when you slow down." Ellie gave her a look. "That doesn't make sense." "Try it anyway." Ellie tried it. The stitches evened out. She looked at them for a second, grudgingly. "Okay," she said. They worked in silence for a while. Outside, Tommy was doing something in the yard. They could hear him occasionally. The sound of a boy who had been rediscovering, incrementally, what it was to make noise. Started talking more. Not to everyone, still. Not to his father. Not really. Not about anything that mattered. But to Nora, and increasingly to May. And sometimes, when he didn't know she was listening, to himself. "Can I ask you something?" Ellie said. "Yes," Nora said. Ellie kept her eyes on her sewing. "Did you know when you answered the advertisement that the other women had left? Your father told me in his letter that previous arrangements had failed," Nora said. He didn't go into detail. "The first one cried the whole first day," Ellie said, with the clinical detachment of a girl reciting facts. She said the house was too remote and the children were too sad. She said she hadn't realized. A pause. "She left before the end of the week. Must have been hard," Nora said. "On all of you. Papa tried not to show it." Ellie's needle moved, slow and even now. The second one. She stopped. Her jaw worked. She was nicer. She tried harder. But she kept rearranging things. Mama's things. She moved the blue pitcher from the shelf where Mama kept it and put it on the window, and her voice tightened. "I told her to put it back, and she said I was being difficult, and I mightn't." She stopped. "You made sure she knew she wasn't welcome," Nora said. A long pause. "Yes," Ellie said quietly. "Not proudly. Just honestly." "You were protecting something," Nora said. "I understand that. You haven't moved anything." Ellie said it carefully, like she'd been holding it and wasn't sure whether to put it down here. "No," Nora said. "It's not my house to rearrange." Ellie started. Stopped. Started again, and this time her voice was lower, stripped of its defensive edge. "Still Mama's house. It still smells like her in some places. If I stand in the right spot in the hall, I can still—" She stopped. Nora put her sewing down. She didn't reach for Ellie. She didn't move toward her. She just sat and waited and let the girl find her way through it. "I don't want to forget what she smelled like," Ellie said. Came out very small. "I try to remember, and sometimes I can, and sometimes I—" Her breath caught. "I'm scared that one day I'll try to remember, and there'll be nothing there." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's one of the hardest things." "Yes." "Does it happen?" Ellie looked at her directly, and in her face was the terrible need for an honest answer rather than a comforting one. "Do people forget?" Nora thought about her own mother. 11 years old, and a cast-iron stove, and a garden that needed tending. She thought about what she still had, and what had gone. "Some things fade," she said. "I won't lie to you about that. The exact sound of a voice, or a particular expression, those can get harder to hold. But other things don't go. The feeling of being loved by her, what it meant to be her daughter, the things she showed you how to do." She looked at the bread Ellie had made 2 weeks ago, and Ellie followed her eyes and understood. Those don't go. Ellie looked at the table. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was not going to cry, had decided not to cry, and meant it. "I'm not trying to be her," Nora said quietly. "I'm not trying to take her place. I know I can't, and I wouldn't try." She picked her sewing back up. "I'm just trying to make it so you don't have to be everyone's mother at 13. That's all." Ellie was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked her sewing back up too, and her stitches were still slow. still careful, and the hem came out even. She didn't say anything else that afternoon. But when supper was done and Nora was cleaning up, Ellie came and stood beside her at the basin and picked up the drying cloth and started drying the dishes without being asked. Without comment, without ceremony, just two people working side by side at the end of a day, which was, Nora had always thought, one of the quieter ways that people choose each other. She found the drawing by accident. She was making the children's beds, a task Ellie had been doing, but had lately been letting Nora take over. The way someone carefully, incrementally, sets down a weight they've been carrying, and in Tommy's room, under the mattress, she found a folded piece of paper. She almost left it there. It wasn't her business. But the corner of it was sticking out, and she'd already touched it in the process of straightening the mattress, and something made her unfold it. It was a drawing. A family rendered in pencil in the clumsy, earnest style of an 8-year-old who is trying hard and has more feeling than skill. 4 figures. She could tell which was Caleb by the height, and May by the small size, and Ellie by the braid the figure was wearing. 4th figure was larger, soft-lined, with her hair pinned back in an apron. Tommy had drawn her in. He had drawn her as part of the family, standing with them, included. He had drawn her in, and then folded the paper and put it under his mattress, where nobody would see it. Stood there for a moment with the drawing in her hands. The winter light came thin through the window. Downstairs she could hear May talking to herself the way she did. A continuous quiet monologue about nothing and everything, and the sound of Ellie moving in the kitchen, and from outside somewhere the faint sound of Dutch and Caleb working. She folded the drawing again, exactly along its original creases, and put it back where she'd found it. Tucked the mattress corner back down, smoothed the quilt. She stood for one more moment in Tommy's room, this quiet room with its boy things and its hidden drawing. And she held what she felt without examining it too closely, because she knew if she examined it too closely she would be in trouble. She was already in trouble, had been for a while now probably. She just hadn't let herself say so yet. Caleb found her that evening on the porch. She was sitting in the cold without her coat, which was not wise, and she knew it, but she'd needed the air and the dark, and a few minutes of nobody needing anything from her. She heard the door and then felt rather than heard him stop when he saw her there. He went back inside and came back out with her coat and put it over her shoulders, without saying anything about the fact that she didn't have it. He sat in the other chair. He was quiet. They both were for a while. The stars were very clear the way they got after cold days, the sky hard and bright. Dutch told me about what Hartwell is planning, he said. County seat. The formal complaint. I know, she said. I'm not going to let that happen. You may not have a choice. I always have a choice, he said. It's my name on this land. She pulled the coat tighter. Caleb, I need you to think about the children before you do anything. Not just tomorrow. 2 years from now. 5, she looked at him. If this becomes a real battle with the town, Ellie is the one who goes to school in that town when you finally get a school teacher. May is the one who grows up, knowing people looked at her family sideways. Think about that before you decide how hard you're going to fight. He looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me not to fight for you. I'm asking you to fight smart, she said. There's a difference. Quiet. In the field beyond the porch, something moved a horse, probably restless in its pen. The wind was low tonight, just enough to move things slightly. When Claire died, he said, I spent about 6 months being angry at everything. The weather, the cattle, Dutch, myself. He stopped. I was no good to anyone during that time. I was present, but I wasn't there. He looked at the dark field. Ellie picked up everything I dropped. She never asked me to. Never complained. She just did it. His voice had something rough in it now, something that wasn't smoothed over. I owe her a father who's actually present, not just a man who shows up and works. She knows you love her, Nora said. Knowing and feeling are different things for a 13-year-old girl, he said. She looked at him. He was staring at the field, jaw set, working through something. This man who did not talk easily and meant it when he did. Tell her that, Nora said. What you just told me. Tell her. He looked at her. How do you do that? Do what? Know what to say. When to say it. When not to. He shook his head slightly. I look at you with them, and it looks easy. I know it isn't, but it looks like it. It doesn't look easy to me, she said. I second-guess myself constantly. I lie awake thinking about whether I said the wrong thing or pushed too hard or not enough. She was quiet for a second. I just don't show it, because showing it doesn't help anyone. He absorbed that. You've been alone a long time, he said. Not unkindly, more the way someone says a thing they've figured out and are naming aloud. Yes, she said, not elaborating. Where he stopped. I'm sorry. That's not my business, you can ask, she said. Were you unhappy? Before this, she thought about Gerald Hauser and the general store and the cold field with the yellowing grass. She thought about $18.40 and a trunk with 3 books she couldn't part with. Thought about the train platform and nobody coming to see her off and not being entirely surprised. I was making do, she said. There's a difference between unhappy and making do. Making do can go on a very long time before you realize it isn't actually living. Quiet. Were you? She asked, after Claire. Were you? I was surviving, he said. Same thing, I think. He looked at his hands on the arms of the chair. Still am. Mostly. But he stopped. It's different now. The house is different. The children are. He didn't finish. Different, she offered. Yes, he said. He looked at her. In the cold, clear starlight, his face was open in a way she'd not seen it in daylight, the watchfulness down, the guard not quite up. You did that. She shook her head. Nora, he said, did. She was very still for a moment. The sound of her name in his voice was different from how anyone had said it in a very long time. It sat in her chest somewhere and stayed there. Go inside, she said quietly. Cold. You first, he said, she almost argued. Then she stood and pulled his coat tighter over her shoulders and went inside, and after a moment she heard his chair scrape and his footsteps follow. In the kitchen she hung the coat on its peg. She didn't turn around when she heard him come in. She heard him go to the stairs. Then stop, Nora, he said. Good night, Caleb, she said. A long pause. Good night, he said, and went up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, alone in the warm room, her hand flat against the wall beside the coat pegs, feeling her own heartbeat, which was doing something she had told it very firmly not to do, and which was doing it anyway. She did not sleep well that night, or the night after. She was practical enough to know what was happening and honest enough with herself not to dress it up in something more manageable. She had feelings for Caleb Rourke, not the swooning, overnight variety. Nothing about her life had ever moved that fast or that cleanly, but the slow, accumulated kind that comes from watching a person be genuinely good at something hard, from sitting across a table from someone who told you the truth, even when it cost him, from standing on a cold porch in the dark and hearing your name said in a particular way that was different from every other way it had ever been said. She had feelings, and feelings were dangerous, and she knew exactly why they were dangerous, because she was here to care for his children, not to want something for herself, because the town was already building a case against her, because she had been rejected enough times and in enough ways to understand that wanting something was the surest method of making its absence worse, and because Caleb Rourke was a man who had loved his wife, who was still in the places he didn't talk about, living in the shadow of that love, and a woman who showed up answering a newspaper advertisement was not the same thing as a woman chosen. Put it away, firmly, the way she put away most things that couldn't help her right now. She put it in the back of whatever drawer she kept things that had to wait, and she went on doing the work of the house and the children, and she was careful, more careful than before, not to let anything show. December settled in. The cold became serious, the kind of cold that was not a temperature but a presence, that came inside through every gap and made the mornings a particular act of will. Nora added a second quilt to May's bed and put a length of oilcloth over the gap at the bottom of the kitchen door and reorganized the firewood storage in the lean-to so that the morning's supply was always within reach without going fully outside. These were not romantic gestures. They were just the small, necessary adjustments of a person learning a place well enough to take care of it properly. Caleb noticed all of it. She knew he did, in the way she knew most things about the house. Now by peripheral attention, by inference, by the particular quality of a person's silence when they are aware of something, but not saying so. He noticed the oilcloth and the wood and the second quilt on May's bed, and he didn't say anything about any of it. And his not saying was not indifference, but something more careful than that. Tommy was reading on his own now. Real reading, not following along while she read aloud, but sitting with a book open in his lap and his lips not moving, his eyes simply moving across the page. She had found him one morning in the kitchen, before breakfast with the lamp pulled close, and the book she'd lent him open in front of him, and an expression on his face that was as close to peaceful as she'd seen on him. And she had come in quietly and started the stove without saying anything about it, and let the moment be what it was. He looked up eventually and said, "He finds the cave in this part." "I know," she said. "What do you think of it?" He thought about that, with the seriousness he's brought to most things. "I think he was scared," Tommy said. "But he went anyway." "Yes," she said. "That's usually how it works." He looked at the page for a moment. "Were you scared when you came here?" She stirred the oatmeal without looking up. "Yes," she said. "Of us?" She considered the question seriously, which he deserved. "Of not being enough," she said. "Not of you." He absorbed that. Then he went back to his book, and she went back to the oatmeal. And that was the whole conversation. But it was the kind of conversation that was more than it looked like. The formal complaint arrived the second week of December. Came not as a letter this time, but as a visit. Two men from the county seat, a clerk and someone who identified himself as an adjudicator of community concerns. Title Nora had never heard and suspected had been invented. For the occasion arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning when the sky was flat and white, and the cold had an edge to it that promised more snow by nightfall. Caleb was in the south field with Dutch when they arrived. Nora was in the kitchen with May, and she heard the wagon and looked out the window and understood immediately, with the clarity of someone who had been expecting something, what this was. She told May to stay in the kitchen, then she went to the door. Clerk was a slight man with a careful expression, the look of someone who handles difficult situations by being very precise and very neutral. The adjudicator was larger, older, with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent time outdoors, and the manner of a man accustomed to being listened to. The adjudicator started. "Miss Whitaker," she said. "Nora Whitaker. Miss Whitaker, we're here to speak with Mr. Rourke regarding a complaint filed by several members of the Broken Creek community concerning the domestic arrangements at this property." "Mr. Rourke is in the field," she said. "You're welcome to wait, or I can go and get him." The adjudicator looked at her with the particular look of a man recalibrating. She had not, apparently, been what he expected. She was aware of what she looked like to him, a large, plain-faced young woman in a working dress and apron, standing in a doorway of a ranch house in the middle of a Nebraska winter. She was aware, and she let him look, and she did not move out of the doorway. "We'll wait," the clerk said, pleasantly enough. "Come inside then," she said. Cold. She brought them into the kitchen, where May was sitting at the table with her rag doll, and regarding the strangers with the solemn, unblinking attention she brought to all unfamiliar things. Nora poured coffee without asking whether they wanted it, because it was cold and they were inside, and that was what you did. She set it on the table and then went to the door and told the adjudicator she'd go and find Mr. Rourke, and she went out across the yard to the south field. She found Caleb at the fence line and told him, quietly and without drama, who was at the house and why. His face went still, and then said in a way she recognized not anger exactly, more the expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and has now reached the end of patience. "All right," he said, Caleb. She put her hand on his arm without thinking about it, and felt him go slightly still at the touch, and did not move her hand. "Don't make it worse. Hear them out first." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Are you worried about me or about yourself?" "Both," she said honestly. which is why I need you to go in there calmly and listen before you say anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, and they walked back to the house. Conversation was not shouting. That was the hardest part. It was all very civil, which made it somehow more awful than shouting would have been. The adjudicator explained that a formal complaint had been filed by 7 members of the Broken Creek community, led by Mrs. Adeline Hartwell, concerning the improper domestic arrangement at the Rourke property. The complaint cited the presence of an unmarried young woman as the primary household manager in the home of a widowed man, without formal employment contract or chaperonage. It cited concern for the moral welfare of the children, requested that the arrangement be modified or terminated. Caleb listened to all of it, with his hands flat on the table and his face carefully controlled. When the adjudicator finished, he said, "My children are fed and warm and sleeping through the night for the first time in a year. My daughter has stopped trying to be the adult of the household. My son is reading again." He paused. "Which part of that is the community concerned about?" Clerk said, carefully. "The concern, Mr. Rourke, is one of propriety." "Propriety," Caleb said. "Yes, sir, 7 people," Caleb said. "Out of how many in this county?" The adjudicator shifted. "Formal complaint requires only—" "I know what it requires." Caleb looked at him directly. "I also know Adeline Hartwell, and I know what this is. This is not concern for my children. My children are the reason Miss Whitaker is here, and anyone who wants to argue about propriety while those children finally have someone steady is welcome to try that argument to my face." "Mr. Rourke," Nora said quietly. He looked at her. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she turned to the adjudicator. "May I ask what resolution the complaint is requesting?" Clerk consulted his paper. "The complainant's request that Miss Whitaker's employment at this property be terminated and that Mr. Rourke seek alternative domestic arrangements of a more appropriate nature." Kitchen was very quiet. May was still at the table. She had been still and quiet through all of it, with the uncanny quality children sometimes have of understanding, without understanding, that something important is happening. "I see," Nora said. "Miss Whitaker," the adjudicator said, and his voice had shifted slightly less official now, more human. "I want to be clear that this office takes no position on your personal character. The complaint is one of form, not of—" "I know what the complaint is," she said. "I've been aware of it for several weeks." She looked at the table for a moment, then at Caleb, who was watching her with something urgent in his face, then back at the adjudicator. "Can I ask if the domestic arrangement were formalized? Would the complaint be resolved?" A silence. "What do you mean by formalized?" the clerk asked. "I mean, if my position here were given a formal legal structure, employment contract," or she stopped. She was aware of Caleb going very still across the table, or some other formalized arrangement. The adjudicator looked at the clerk. Something passed between them. A formal employment contract, properly witnessed and filed, would address the core of the complaint. "Yes," the adjudicator said carefully. "The concern is the informal nature of the arrangement." "Give me a week," she said. The adjudicator looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "We'll return on the 21st, he said. "If a formal arrangement has been made and documented, the matter will be considered addressed." They left. Nora heard the wagon pull away. She stood at the window watching it go, and behind her the kitchen was very quiet, and she could feel Caleb looking at her back. "What did you mean?" he said. "Formalized arrangement." She didn't turn around immediately. "I was thinking of a proper employment contract," she said. "Dutch mentioned there's a solicitor in Nora." His voice was quiet but very direct. "It's not what you meant." She turned around. He was standing on his side of the table, and his face was open in the way it got, sometimes when he wasn't guarding it, and there was something in it she couldn't manage to look away from. "It would resolve the complaint," she said. "A contract properly witnessed." "Yes," he said. "It would." He looked at her steadily. "So would a marriage." The words sat in the kitchen between them, like something that had fallen from a height and landed solidly, and was not going to be moved easily. She felt her face go carefully neutral. She was good at that. She had years of practice. "That's not—" she started. I'm not asking you out of convenience, he said. I want to be very clear about that. He came around the table, not fast, not dramatically, just moving to the same side of the table as her, which reduced the distance between them to something she had to consciously hold her ground against. I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 3 weeks, and I have not been successful. So I'm going to say it badly, and you can decide what you think of it. She waited. I don't know exactly when it happened, he said. I'm not a man who pays a lot of attention to that kind of thing when something shifts. But somewhere between you, fixing the porch board in a snowstorm, and staying with May at night and telling Ellie the truth when she needed it, and standing in my kitchen, not saying anything until you had something worth saying. He stopped. Stopped thinking of you as the woman who answered the advertisement. She was very still. I don't want a housekeeper with a contract, he said. I don't want you to stay because it resolves a complaint. I want you to, I'm asking you. He stopped again and looked briefly frustrated with himself, which was the most human she had ever seen him look. I'm doing this badly. You're doing all right, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. Nora. He said her name in that particular way again. I'm asking you to marry me. And I'm telling you, it has nothing to do with the men from the county seat, and everything to do with the fact that this house has been more of a home in the last 2 months than it has been in the last 14. And that's because of you, and I am aware enough to know it. Clock on the mantel ticked. May had slid off her chair and disappeared somewhere, with the uncanny sense children have of knowing when to remove themselves. She had spent 28 years being unwanted in one form or another. She had spent those years learning to need less, to expect less, to be grateful for whatever space the world offered her and not ask for more. She had developed a whole internal architecture around not wanting, around managing her own hope before it could be managed for her, around the knowledge that her body and her plainness and her quiet presence were things the world largely looked past. And now she was standing in a ranch kitchen in Nebraska in December, with a man looking at her with the kind of directness that left no room for uncertainty. And something in her wanted to say yes immediately, and something else, the older, more careful part, was already building the argument against it. You don't have to do this, she said. I know I don't, he said. County seat complaint can be handled with a contract. Nora. He said it with a patience that had something underneath it, something that was not quite frustration, but was adjacent to it. I just told you it's not about the complaint. I know what you told me. She looked at him. I'm not sure you've thought it through. I've thought about very little else for 3 weeks, he said. My children already think of you as Ellie made her mother's bread with you. Tommy draws you in the family. He stopped when he saw her face change. He showed me, he said more quietly. He brought it to me himself. She felt that move through her in a way she couldn't quite account for. Tommy, who kept everything inside, who measured his words like they cost him. Something Tommy had brought his father the drawing and shown him. What did you say to him? She asked. I said I was thinking the same thing, Caleb said. He seemed satisfied with that. She looked at the window. Sky was the flat white of incoming snow. Outside was winter and hard ground, and a county full of people who had opinions about her. Inside was this kitchen and this man, looking at her, like she was not something to be evaluated and found wanting, but something he had found and recognized and wanted to keep. She was aware of everything that could go wrong. She was a thorough person, and she had a thorough list. Town would talk. Mrs. Hartwell would find some other angle. She was not Claire, would never be Claire, and there would be moments when that absence was the loudest thing in the room. She barely knew this man. 2 months was not long. She had made exactly one large leap of faith in her life, getting on that train, and this would be a second and considerably larger one. I'm not a small woman, she said. It came out of nowhere, or it came from somewhere very deep from Gerald Hauser and his laugh, and the cold field and 28 years. Case you haven't noticed. He looked at her for a moment. I noticed, he said. I also noticed that you mended Tommy's coat and fixed my porch and put a quilt on May's bed and made Ellie feel like she didn't have to be everyone's mother. I noticed all of it. He held her gaze. None of what I noticed has anything to do with how much of you there is. She felt something break loose in her chest. Not dramatically. Just the way something breaks loose when it has been held in place too long, and the thing holding it finally lets go. I need to think, she said. All right, he said. Take your time. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. I will give you an answer. I need a day. Take whatever you need, he said. And he went back outside, because he was that kind of man, the kind who said a hard thing and then gave you room with it, who didn't press or hover or perform his own waiting, who just let a thing exist and trusted it to hold. She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of not sleeping. Not anxious, just awake, alert to something. She lay in the narrow room off the kitchen and listened to the house, which had its own vocabulary now, the stove settling, the boards contracting in the cold, May breathing steady upstairs, occasional shift of someone turning over in their sleep. She knew all of it by now, the whole grammar of this house, and she lay listening to it and thought about what it would mean to stay in it permanently. Not as the woman who answered the advertisement, but as something else entirely. She thought about her mother, about what her mother had been and what she'd given and how she'd died before Nora had understood how to say thank you for it. She thought about what it would mean to be May's. She searched for the word. Not mother, not that, but the woman who stayed, the one who would be there when May was 8 and 10 and 13 and needed someone to sit with her in the dark. She thought about Tommy and his book and his drawing and his where we said in a voice that had come back from wherever it had gone. She thought about Ellie, who was learning to set down what she'd been carrying, who had made her mother's bread again. She thought about herself. This was the part that was hard, because thinking about herself required a kind of directness she'd avoided for a long time. She thought about what she wanted, not what was reasonable, not what was safe, not what made sense, given everything she'd been told about what someone like her could expect. She thought about what she actually genuinely wanted, alone in the dark, where nobody could see her want it. She wanted to stay. She wanted the kitchen and the cold mornings and the children and the hard work and the slow incremental reality of building something with people who needed building alongside them. She wanted May's weight against her arm in the dark. She wanted Tommy's "Where were we?" She wanted Ellie's measured, grudging, real trust, which was worth more than any easy warmth because it had cost them both. And she wanted Caleb. That was the thing she hadn't let herself say clearly yet, and in the dark she said it clearly. She wanted the man who wrote, "I cannot promise you easy, I can promise you real," who had told her the truth about his children, without softening it, who stood on a cold porch and said her name like it meant something specific to him. She was terrified. That was also true. She held both things, the wanting and the terror, and lay there with them. And the night went on, and somewhere around 2 in the morning she stopped being terrified enough to let the wanting be bigger. In the morning, she found him before breakfast. He was in the barn, which was where he went when he had things to work through. She'd learned that about him. She pushed open the barn door, and the warmth of animals and hay came out at her. And she went in, and he looked up from what he was doing and went very still. "Yes," she said. He set down what was in his hands. He looked at her across the barn with the particular expression of a man who had not been certain of the answer and was now recalibrating. "Yes," she said again, because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it without qualification. Not because of the county seat, not because it resolves anything, because she stopped and then kept going because stopping was the coward's way out. Because May turned toward me in the dark, and I would like to be there the next time she does. Because Tommy is 8 years old, and he's learning to trust people again, and that matters more to me than almost anything. Because Ellie is putting down what she's been carrying, and she needs someone here to help her do that, and I want to be that person. She took a breath, and because when you say my name, it sounds like you mean it, and I have not had that before. He crossed the barn in 4 steps, and she was aware of him stopping just close enough that the warmth of him was something she could feel in the cold air of the barn, and he looked at her face for one moment, really looked, the way he had in the doorway, the very first night, that careful assessment, and then he put his hand against her jaw, gentle, like something he wasn't sure yet was entirely real, and she covered his hand with hers. "I mean it," he said, if that was unclear. It wasn't unclear, she said. They stayed that way for a moment in the cold barn. Not kissing yet, just standing together in that particular proximity of two people who have decided something about each other. Outside, the wind moved against the barn walls, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and from the house, faint but audible, came the sound of May's voice saying something to someone in the morning light. "The children," she said. "I'll talk to them," he said. "Talk to Tommy first," she said. "He needs to hear it from you before anyone else." He looked at her. "You already know that." "I know him," she said simply. He did something that was not quite a smile, more the expression of a man who has been a long time alone and has just been reminded of what it is to have someone who pays attention. "All right," he said. "Tommy first." Tommy took the news in the serious, measuring way he took most things. Caleb told him after breakfast, quietly, without ceremony, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window. Nora was in the lean-to, pointedly doing something else, but close enough to hear. "I'm going to ask Miss Whitaker to be my wife," Caleb said, and she said yes. "I wanted to tell you first." A silence. "I know," Tommy said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I showed you the drawing," Tommy said, in the tone of someone stating something obvious. Another silence. Then Caleb said, "Yes, you did. She puts me back in the right place in the book when I lose it," Tommy said. "She always knows where I was." He seemed to consider this sufficient explanation. "Is she going to be our mother?" "She's going to be Nora," Caleb said. "What that means, you'll figure that out together." Tommy was quiet. "Okay," he said, and went back to his book. Ellie was harder. Ellie was always harder, which was not a complaint. It was just the truth of a girl who had learned that things could be taken away, and had decided very early not to make peace with anything until it proved it was going to stay. Caleb told her in the afternoon, alone, in the kitchen. Nora stayed out of it, completely. She took May out to the barn to look at the horses, which May considered a tremendous treat, and she stayed out there in the cold with the horses and the child, and let whatever was happening in the kitchen happen. When she came back in, Ellie was at the table. Her face was controlled, but her eyes were red at the corners. She looked at Nora. Nora looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ellie said, "You're not going to move the blue pitcher." "No," Nora said. A pause. "And you're not going to try to be her." "No," Nora said. "I wouldn't try that." Ellie looked at the table. Her jaw worked. "She would have liked you," she said finally. Came out rough, the way things do when they cost a lot to say. "Mama." She liked people who were practical and didn't fuss. She stopped. That's what Papa said, anyway. Nora felt the weight of that gift, the thing Ellie had just given her, the hardest thing she had, and she held it carefully. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Ellie got up from the table and went to the counter and started doing something that didn't need doing, the way she always did when she'd said more than she meant to. And Nora let her, and started supper. And they worked together in the kitchen in the quiet way they had built. And the house settled into the late afternoon around them. And from upstairs came the sound of Tommy reading aloud to May. She could hear his voice, slow and clear, the words finding their way through the floor, and outside the snow had started, again, coming down in the soft, patient way of snow that intended to stay. She stood at the stove and listened to Tommy's voice reading, and May's occasional questions, and the fire doing its work, and Ellie moving behind her, and thought, this is what it is. All of it, the hard and the ordinary, and the incomplete and the grief still living in the walls. This is what it is. And she stayed at the stove and kept cooking, because supper needed making, because the children were hungry, because the snow was coming down and the house was warm, and there was something to stay for. Outside, the snow covered the yard in white, clean and indifferent, making the ground new again, the way snow does, without caring what had been there before. Inside, the Rourke house held its people imperfect, Grieving, tentative, real, and Nora Whitaker stood at the center of it. A woman who had come here with nothing, not asking for much, and found, without quite planning to, that she had become necessary, not because she was beautiful, not because she was easy to love, but because she had stayed. The adjudicator and his clerk came back on the 21st, as promised. The snow from the week before had packed down hard, and the road to the ranch was rough going, and they arrived looking cold and slightly irritated in the way of men who have made an uncomfortable journey on official business and are hoping to conclude it quickly. Nora watched them come from the kitchen window. She had the coffee ready. She had been ready since before dawn, in the way she was always ready for things she had spent time thinking about. Caleb came in from the barn when he saw the wagon. He came into the kitchen and looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was not nervous act and exact. Zut was the shared acknowledgement of two people who have decided something together and are now about to find out what it costs. You don't have to be in the room, he said. Yes, I do, she said. He nodded once. She picked up the coffee pot. They sat at the kitchen table, the four of them, in the same configuration as before. The adjudicator had his papers. The clerk had his pen. Caleb sat with his hands flat on the table, and Nora sat beside him, not across, beside, and that positioning was its own statement, though she hadn't planned it consciously. It was simply where she belonged in the room. We've come regarding the complaint filed by the adjudicator began. We're getting married, Caleb said. The adjudicator stopped. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Nora. He looked at his papers as if they might have anticipated this development and offered guidance. I see, he said. I've spoken with the solicitor in town, Caleb continued. Fielding. He's drawing up the paperwork. We intend to marry before the new year. The clerk was writing something. The adjudicator folded his hands on the table with the manner of a man reorganizing his approach. That would, of course, resolve the central concern of the complaint, he said. Propriety of an unmarried. I know what the complaint says, Caleb said. I've read it 4 times. A pause. Yes, well, the adjudicator gathered himself. If the marriage is formalized and documented before the new year, this office will consider the matter fully addressed. The complainants will be so informed. You can tell Mrs. Hartwell personally, Caleb said, that the Rourke household is not her concern. The adjudicator looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression was not entirely unsympathetic. Mr. Rourke, he said carefully, I would encourage. I know, Caleb said. I'll be civil, he said it, in the voice of a man who was committing to something that was going to require effort. They left without finishing their coffee. Nora watched the wagon go down the track and then turned back to the kitchen, and Caleb was standing there with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has just done something irrevocable and is taking stock of that. That went as well as it could, she said. Hartwell's going to be angry, he said. She was already angry, Nora said. At least now she knows it didn't work. He looked at her for a moment. Are you all right? Question surprised her, not because it was strange, but because it was specific not. Is everything all right, or will this be fine? But are you all right? Directed at her, about her. She had not been on the receiving end of that question very often, and it still caught her slightly off guard when it came. I will be, she said, which was honest. The news reached town before the wagon did, because that is the nature of small places. Information moves faster than the people carrying it. By the time Dutch made the supply run 2 days later, everyone in Broken Creek knew that Caleb Rourke was marrying the woman from the advertisement, the one the Hartwell complaint had been about, the large, plain-faced woman from Kansas who had apparently decided she was staying regardless of what anyone thought about it. Dutch reported all of this with his customary economy of words. People are talking, he said. I know, Nora said. Some of them think it's not right, he said. I know that too. Some of them. Dutch said, a little more carefully, think it's about time Caleb found himself some sense. She looked at him. He was studying the middle distance with elaborate interest. Which camp are you in? She asked. I'm in the camp that noticed May slept through the night for the first time last week, he said, and that Tommy talked at breakfast for 20 minutes straight, and Ellie went to bed before 10 for the first time since Claire died. He picked up his hat. I'll get the supplies. He went out. Nora stood in the kitchen and felt the warmth of what he'd said settle into her without making too much of it, the way warmth does when it comes from someone who doesn't offer it easily. Adeline Hartwell came to the ranch on a Thursday. Nora had half expected it and half not. She'd imagined the woman continuing her campaign at a distance, letters, conversations in parlors, the slow pressure of organized disapproval. She had not quite imagined her arriving in person at the Rourke gate on a bitter December morning in a good wool coat, alone, without the usual surrounding retinue of like-minded women. Caleb was out. The children were inside. Nora went to the door. Adeline Hartwell was a handsome woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and the erect posture of someone who has strong opinions about the relationship between character and spine. She was not what Nora had built in her imagination, not cartoonishly cruel, not small-minded in an obvious way. She had the look of a woman who genuinely believed she was doing right, which made her harder to be angry at than someone who knew they were causing harm and did it anyway. They looked at each other across the threshold. Mrs. Hartwell, Nora, said Miss Whitaker. The woman paused. Or I suppose it will be Mrs. Rourke shortly. Yes, Nora said. Come in if you'd like. It's cold. Mrs. Hartwell came in. She looked at the kitchen, the order of it, the warmth, the evidence of a household functioning. May was at the table with her doll and looked up at the stranger with her usual solemn attention. Nora poured coffee, because it was what she did, and she put the cup in front of Mrs. Hartwell and sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I want you to understand, Mrs. Hartwell said finally, that my concern was for the children. Not, she stopped. I am aware that I may have expressed it in ways that were unkind. You called me names, Nora said, in public, in front of Ellie. Mrs. Hartwell's jaw tightened. Not with defiance, something more uncomfortable than that. I did not know Ellie was present, she said. She was, Nora said. She heard it. The kitchen was quiet except for May's quiet murmuring to her doll. Mrs. Hartwell looked at her hands around the coffee cup. She was not, Nora thought, a woman who apologized easily or often. The apology, when it came, had the quality of something that had been worked toward from a distance and was now being delivered with effort. I should not have said what I said, Mrs. Hartwell said. About you, personally. No, Nora agreed. Shouldn't have. I was trying to protect. You were trying to enforce a standard, Nora said, and the standard hurt people who didn't deserve it. Me and Ellie, and indirectly those children, who were finally getting something stable and had to watch the town try to take it away. She said it without heat, which was harder than saying it with heat would have been. I understand. You thought you were doing right. I'm telling you what it looked like from inside it. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. May had abandoned her doll and was now watching both adults with the focused attention of a child who senses something significant is happening. The children look well, Mrs. Hartwell said finally. Her voice had changed softer or more honest, some of the official quality gone from it. Ellie's looks. She looks like she's been sleeping. She has, Nora said. Mrs. Hartwell looked at her then, really looked, in the way she probably hadn't done before, not as a category or a problem or a symbol of something improper, but as a person sitting across a table from her. Whatever she saw made something shift in her expression. Not dramatic, just a small visible adjustment. Caleb Rourke is a good man, she said. I know, Nora said. She stopped. Claire was a friend of mine for many years. Her voice tightened slightly on the word. When she died, I didn't know what to do with that. And she stopped again. I think I made Caleb's household my concern because I couldn't let go of caring what happened to her family. Nora looked at her. She had not expected this. She sat with it for a moment, recalibrating. Then you understand, Nora said carefully, that what I want for that family and what you want for it are the same thing. Mrs. Hartwell met her eyes. Perhaps, she said. I'm beginning to think so. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not warmth or sudden friendship or the kind of tidy resolution that makes a story feel finished. It was two women sitting across a table in a cold December kitchen, acknowledging that they had both been in different ways, trying to protect the same children, and that one of them had gone about it in a way that caused real harm, and that this fact was now on the table between them and would have to be lived with. Mrs. Hartwell left without staying long. At the door she paused and looked at May, who had followed them to the doorway and was standing with her doll pressed against her chest. "She's grown," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "Since I last saw her." "Children do," Nora said. The woman nodded once and went to her wagon and drove back toward town. Nora stood in the doorway watching her go and felt something complicated, not triumph, not vindication, something quieter. The particular feeling of a conflict that has not been won so much as survived, which is usually the most honest outcome. May tugged her sleeve. "Is she the mean lady?" she asked. "She's a person who made some mistakes," Nora said. "Most people." May considered this. "Oh," she said, and went back inside. They married on the 28th of December. It was not a large ceremony. Not because they were hiding from anything. The county seat complaint had been formally withdrawn the week before, documented and filed, and the Broken Creek solicitor Fielding had handled the paperwork with quiet competence, but because neither of them was the kind of person who wanted a performance of a thing they intended to mean seriously. Caleb had asked, and she had said yes, and now they were going to do it, and the doing of it was the point. Fielding came to the ranch. Dutch stood as witness, which seemed right Dutch, who had told her on the wagon ride in that the children were grieving and had said, "You're a steadier person than most people I've met," and had meant both things without contradiction. Ellie stood beside her father in a dress she had pressed carefully the night before, her hair in the braid she usually wore, her face controlled and serious in the way that meant she was feeling a great deal and had decided where to keep it. Tommy stood on Caleb's other side, formal and still in his good shirt, looking at Nora with the quiet, evaluating attention he brought to important things. May wore her best dress and her good shoes and had put a ribbon in her hair by herself, which was lopsided but enthusiastic, and she stood next to Nora and held Nora's hand with both of hers, which was not planned, and which Nora had not asked for, and which made it impossible for one moment to look anywhere in particular without losing her composure. Fielding read the words. Caleb said what he had to say in a clear voice without rushing it. Nora said what she had to say, and her voice was steady because she had decided it was going to be steady, and it held. When Fielding said it was done, Caleb put his hand against her face the way he had in the barn, the same gesture, and this time he kissed her, carefully and briefly, and meaning it. May said yay in a very small voice. Dutch made the sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Ellie looked at the window, then at the floor, then at her father and Nora, and her face did something complicated and private and real, and she didn't say anything. But she reached out and touched Nora's arm, just for a moment the lightest contact, a finger against her sleeve, and then she looked away again, and Nora understood that this was everything Ellie had to give right now, and that it was enough. Tommy shook Caleb's hand, which made Caleb look at him with an expression that had things in it. Nora looked away from because they were too private to witness. Then Tommy looked at Nora and said, "I think you were on page 47. She blinked. "What?" "The book. Last time we were reading together. I think you were on page 47. She felt something move through her that started as a laugh and became something more than that. Something that had the weight of the past 3 months in it. The train platform and the cold field and the narrow room off the kitchen, and May's face against her arm in the dark and the drawing folded under the mattress and Ellie making her. Mother's bread and all of it, arriving here in this moment. "I'll find the page," she said. January came in February, and the winter settled in for the long stretch that Nebraska winters do, the kind of cold that stops being news and just becomes the condition of the world. The ranch ran. The children grew. The household found its shape. It was not perfect. Nothing in it was perfect, and Nora had stopped expecting perfection from anything somewhere around the age of 12 and had never gone back to expecting it. There were mornings when Caleb was short-tempered from bad weather and cattle trouble and the weight of keeping a ranch alive through winter, and there were evenings when he came in too tired to be present the way he wanted to be. There were days when Ellie's old guardedness came back, when she pulled the walls up and moved through the house with the careful efficiency of someone reminding herself she didn't need anyone. There were nights when May still cried, less often now but still, and there were times when the crying came with a word mama that moved through the house like cold air under a door, touching everyone it reached. And there were things that were not resolved, not neatly. Grief did not resolve. Nora had learned this early and never forgotten it. Grief was not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be lived alongside, and the Rourke house would carry Claire Rourke's absence in its walls for a long time yet, maybe always in certain ways. The blue pitcher stayed on the shelf where she had kept it. On Claire's birthday in February, Ellie made her bread again alone this time, early in the morning before anyone else was up, and when Nora came downstairs and smelled it, she understood and simply started the coffee and did not say anything and did not need to. There were also things that were good in ways she had not let herself imagine. Evenings when Caleb sat at the table after supper and talked not about the ranch, not about logistics, but about things he was thinking, slowly and imperfectly, finding his way to them with the careful honesty of a man who had not talked like that in a long time. The Sunday mornings when Tommy read aloud to the whole family, his voice growing in confidence, the words coming easier now. May curled against Nora's side, and Ellie at the table with her sewing and Caleb with his coffee, and the particular completeness of all of them, in one room doing ordinary things together. The afternoon Dutch found her in the lean to working on a broken harness and said, without preamble, "Ranch looks better than it has in 2 years." And she said, "It's had 2 years of Dutch in it, so that tracks," and he made his sound that might be a laugh and went back to what he was doing. Particular good of Ellie asking her, one evening in March, how she managed when she was sad not as a child asking an adult, but as one person asking another, the walls down genuine. And Nora saying, honestly, that she was still figuring that out, that she'd spent a long time managing sadness alone and was having to learn how to do it differently, and Ellie nodding with the look of someone who understood that from the inside. The letter from Millhaven came in late March. She recognized Mrs. Caldwell's handwriting on the envelope. She opened it at the kitchen table on a cold morning with her coffee, and it was short, Mrs. Caldwell was not a letter writer by nature, but it said what it had to say. Gerald Hauser had remarried in January. A woman from Salina. Apparently she had left him by February. Mrs. Caldwell wrote this with the particular neutrality of a woman, conveying information she has strong feelings about while technically doing no such thing. There was also a line near the end. "We heard you married a rancher in Nebraska. I hope it is good, Nora. You always deserved better than this town gave you." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the early spring light was doing something to the yard, making it look possible again after the long gray months, making the mud and the patches of old snow look like preparation rather than damage. From upstairs came the sound of May waking up, the small vocal process of a 4-year-old orienting themselves to morning. She thought about Gerald Hauser and his laugh in the general store. She thought about who she'd been when that happened, not a different person exactly, but a diminished version of this one. A woman who had learned to take up less space than she needed. She tried to feel something like satisfaction and found mostly just distance. The way something looks when you've moved far enough away from it that it loses its power to reach you. She folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She got up and started breakfast. Caleb came in from the barn. He hung his coat on the peg, the same peg he always used, a habit, so established now she'd stopped seeing it. He looked at her face in the quick, specific way he had developed, the way of a man who has learned to read a particular person. "Something in the post," he said. "Letter from Kansas," she said. "Old neighbor. Good news or bad? She thought about it. Old news, she said, which is mostly just news. Poured his coffee. He sat down. He didn't ask more because he knew her well enough by now to know when something was being closed off and when it was being set down, and this was setting down. He trusted that distinction. The north fence is giving way in the corner section, he said. I'm going to need Tommy's help this afternoon, if the ground's soft enough to work. He'll want to help, she said. He was asking yesterday, when fence season started. Caleb looked at her over his coffee cup. He asked you that? It's me things, she said simply. Caleb was quiet for a moment, and in his face was the look he got sometimes when one of his children showed him something he hadn't known they were carrying, the combination of relief and something that might have been the small, complicated ache of a father discovering his children had lives he wasn't entirely inside. He used to ask me everything, he said. Before. He'll get back there, she said. He's almost there. You sound sure. I've been paying attention for 4 months, she said. I'm reasonably sure. He smiled. Not the almost smile he usually offered, the restrained version, a real one, brief and genuine, and she felt it, the way she always felt it, as something that still surprised her slightly, no matter how often it happened. The first day of April brought something nobody had planned. May got it into her head at breakfast to ask Nora a question she'd apparently been holding for some time. Asked it the way 4-year-olds ask important things without preparation or warning, in the middle of eating her oatmeal as if it had just arrived. Are you our mama now? She said. The table went completely still. Tommy looked at his bowl. Ellie looked at her hands. Caleb looked at Nora. Nora set her spoon down. She looked at May, who was watching her with the enormous, solemn, patient eyes that saw everything and had seen everything since the day Nora arrived. I'm Nora, she said. That's what I am. May considered this. But you do the mama things, she said. Yes, Nora said. I do so. May seemed to feel this settled the matter. She went back to her oatmeal. But Ellie was looking at Nora now, and her face was open in a way Nora had only seen a handful of times without the careful management, without the guarding. Her eyes were bright. I told her you weren't replacing Mama, Ellie said quietly. I told her Mama was Mama, but that you stayed. She stopped. I didn't know what word to use. Stayed is a good word, Nora said. Keeps asking questions. I don't know how to answer, Ellie said, and her voice had the worn-down quality of someone who has been carrying a weight and is finally telling someone about it. About where Mama went. About whether she can still love Mama if she also... She stopped. Her jaw worked. If she also loves me, Nora said quietly. Ellie looked at the table. Yes, she can do both, Nora said. Those aren't the same space. One doesn't push the other out. Ellie was quiet for a moment. How do you know? 'Cause you do too, Nora said. I can see it. And it doesn't seem to be killing you. Ellie looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window, and it fell across the table, across the breakfast things, across Ellie's careful face. Something moved in it, some loosening, some giving way of something that had been held too long. No, Ellie said. It doesn't. Tommy, who had been watching all of this from behind the fortification of his bowl, said, I finished the book. Everyone looked at him. Last night, he said. The cave. He got out. He always gets out, Nora said. Tommy looked at her. You knew? I've read it before. You didn't tell me, he said with mild accusation. You didn't ask, she said, and it was better to find out yourself. He thought about this for a moment and then conceded the point with the grudging fairness of someone who knows they've been outmaneuvered but can see the logic. I want another one, he said. A new one. I have one I think you'll like, she said. After school. We don't have school, he said. We have the kitchen table, she said, which is close enough. Spring came fully in May, and with it the particular relief of the plains returning to green, the long winter finally letting go of the ground. The ranch stirred to life in the way ranches do. The cattle moved. The fences needed attention. The days grew longer and filled themselves with work that was different in character from winter work, more expansive, less about endurance, and more about building. Nora planted a kitchen garden. She had been thinking about it since February, making mental notes of where the light was good and where the soil looked workable and what the ranch was missing in its meals that she could grow rather than pay to have freighted in from town. She spent a Saturday marking out the beds with stakes and string, and May helped by carrying the stakes with tremendous seriousness. And Tommy dug the first bed without being asked because he had apparently decided this was the kind of project worth contributing to. Ellie came out in the afternoon and looked at the staked-out beds. "Mama had a garden," she said, "over there." She pointed to a different spot, gone to weeds now. "I know," Nora said. "Dutch told me. I didn't want to plant on the same ground." Ellie looked at her. Something moved across her face. Then she looked at the weeded-over patch, and then at Nora's new beds. And she said, "Can I plant something in mine?" "All of it's yours," Nora said. "I was hoping you'd want to." Ellie crouched down and picked up some of the turned soil and looked at it with the assessing look she brought to most things. "Tomatoes," she said. "Mama always planted tomatoes there." "Show me where," Nora said. "We'll turn that bed over too." They worked until the light went low, the two of them and Tommy and May, and the garden took shape in the new ground Nora's beds, and in the corner near the south wall, a small patch that Ellie had cleared herself and marked with her own stakes. When they went inside for supper, all of them dirty and tired, Caleb looked at them from the table and said, "What happened to you all?" "Garden," Tommy said, as if this were self-explanatory. Caleb looked at Nora. She looked back. In his face was the expression she had learned to read, not the surface-level ones, the brief smiles and the deliberate silences, but the real expression underneath, the one he didn't put there on purpose, the one that looked like gratitude and also like something larger than gratitude, something for which gratitude was only the nearest approximation. She went to wash her hands. "Sit down," she said. "Supper's almost ready." There is something that the world does not tell women like Nora Whitaker, or tells them too late, or tells them, and then immediately tells them to disbelieve. It tells them that they are too much in the ways that do not matter too large, too plain, too quiet, too without the particular shine that draws the quick attention of a crowded room. And it tells them they are not enough in the ways that do not enough beauty, not enough grace, not enough thus, not enough of whatever it is that earns a woman the right to be chosen. What it does not say, what nobody said to Nora, in Millhaven, Kansas, in all the years she spent being useful and invisible and patient, is that being chosen by a crowded room is not the same thing as being loved. That the woman who gets noticed at the party is not necessarily the woman who can sit with you in a cold barn at the end of a bad day and say, "Go sleep, you look terrible," and mean it as tenderness. That the ability to stay to remain present through grief and difficulty and the ordinary, grinding work of caring for people who are broken is not a consolation prize. It is the thing itself. Nora had believed for a long time that her life was the smaller version, that somewhere there was a larger life she had been excluded from by the particular circumstances of her body and her face and her origins, and that what she had the making do, the being useful, the small dignities of a life on the margins of other people's stories, was what was left over after the better things were distributed. She had been wrong. Not in a fairy tale way, not in the way of stories where the rejected woman is vindicated by a prince, and the people who doubted her are proven comprehensively wrong. More plainly than that, and more importantly, she had been wrong because the life she had been mourning, the larger, chosen, abundant life had not been located somewhere else all along, waiting for her to become acceptable enough to enter it. It had been located all along inside the capacity to stay. She had stayed in that ranch house when the conditions were hard, and the children were hostile and the town was hostile, and there was every practical and emotional reason to leave. She had stayed not because she had nowhere to go, she'd had less than nowhere when she arrived, but because leaving required her to believe, again, that the judgment of people who looked at her and found her lacking was more reliable than her own knowledge of what she was capable of. And she had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she was done outsourcing that judgment. She had not been wrong. This turned out to be enough. More than enough, she had not anticipated how much more. On a Thursday evening in late May, Nora sat on the fixed porch, the one with the board she had repaired in November, which had held all winter without complaint, and watched the light go gold across the Nebraska grass off it. Inside, she could hear Tommy reading to May. He had taken it on himself, somewhere in March, to read to her in the evenings, not because anyone asked, but because he'd noticed May would sit still for it, and he decided that was worth doing. His voice came through the window, slow and clear, and May's occasional interjection came under it, like a second instrument. From the kitchen, she could hear Ellie doing something, the particular sound of her moving efficiently through a space she'd made peace with. She hummed sometimes now, when she didn't know she was doing it. Nora had noticed this weeks ago, and had said nothing about it, and intended to say nothing about it, because some things were more valuable unhighlighted. Caleb came around the side of the house from the barn and saw her on the porch and came to sit in the other chair. He was tired the way. He was always tired. At the end of the day, honestly, the tiredness of a man who had worked hard and meant to do it again tomorrow. He had a small bruise on his jaw from something with a fence post he hadn't fully explained and probably wouldn't. They sat together in the evening quiet. After a while he said, "Dutch is talking about his sister's family coming out from Ohio in the fall." "I know," she said. "He mentioned it. He seems happy about it." "He is," she said. "He misses them." Caleb looked at the light on the grass. "Do you miss Kansas?" She thought about it honestly. "I miss Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "Her letters are good. And I miss—" She stopped. "I miss the person I thought I was going to become there, maybe. Before I understood, I wasn't going to." "What kind of person?" "Smaller one," she said. "With smaller things." She looked at the light. "I don't actually miss it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm glad you," answered the advertisement. "So am I," she said. He reached over and put his hand over hers, on the arm of the chair. Not a dramatic gesture, just the easy, specific contact of two people who have moved past deliberateness into something more habitual and more real. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that, while the light went gold and then amber, and then the first deep blue of evening came in from the east. From inside, Tommy's voice continued, steady and clear, carrying the story forward. "May I ask something? What happened next? Or what did that word mean?" Or some question that 4-year-olds ask when the world is presenting them with something new. And Tommy answered her, with the patient seriousness of a boy who has decided that his sister's questions are worth answering, and Ellie's humming moved under both of them, like a low, warm current. The evening settled around the house, and the house held its people. And Nora Whitaker, who was Nora Rourke now, though she was still getting used to the weight of it, sat on a porch in Nebraska and felt the full, imperfect, real dimensions of the life she was living, and did not find it small. She had come here with nothing. She had stayed because staying was the only thing that had ever truly been hers to give. And it had turned out, as it sometimes does for people who are willing to find out, that staying was exactly enough. The stars came out one by one above the dark grass. Inside, her family moved through the lit rooms of their house. She stayed,